The rope snapped, and the ladder dropped 6 feet before it caught on the broken sill, and Nora Bennett was still on it. She grabbed the stone edge of the window with both hands. Her tool belt swung against her hip, and a chisel clattered down into the dark room below her, and somewhere far off a bell rang, deep and slow, like the castle itself was groaning about the noise she was making. For a moment she just hung there, boots scraping against wet stone, heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Then a hand closed around her wrist. It did not ask permission. It just pulled hard, and she came up over the sill and landed on the floor of the ruined room in a heap of dust and old plaster, coughing, her palms scraped raw. She looked up and found herself staring at a man she had never met, wearing a coat too fine for a building that was falling apart around them both. He was not smiling. "You could have died," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, the kind of voice that had never once been allowed to shout. "On my property, on your first morning." Nora pushed her hair out of her face and looked at the blood on her palm and then back at him. "Good morning to you too," she said. That was how she met the Duke of Ashcombe. She had taken the job 3 weeks earlier, back home in a small town in the north where the mill had closed and half the young people had already left for the cities. Work was work. A restoration company out of London had put out a call for skilled carpenters and stonemasons willing to travel, willing to live on site for months at a time, willing to keep quiet about what they saw. The pay was good, better than good. Nora had a mother with a bad hip and a roof at home that leaked every winter, and she did not ask too many questions about why a private estate needed people who could keep quiet. She had pictured a manor house, something grand but manageable, a weekend project blown up to professional size. She had not pictured this. Ashcombe Castle sat on a hill above a village that seemed to have grown around it the way moss grows around a stone, slow and patient, and a little afraid to touch it directly. The main house was still occupied, still grand, still full of staff who moved through it like it was any other old English home. But one wing of it was different. The east wing had been closed for 11 years. Nora had learned that much from the driver who brought her up from the station, a cheerful older man named Peter who talked the whole way and then went quiet the moment the castle came into view, like even mentioning it too loudly might wake something up. "There was a fire," was all he said. "Long time back now, nobody goes in there." Nora, standing in the wrecked room with her palm bleeding and a Duke glaring down at her like she was a structural hazard he hadn't budgeted for, was starting to understand exactly why. "The scaffolding outside is not secured to code," she said, because it was true, and because she did not know what else to say to a man who had just saved her life and then criticized her for needing saving. "Whoever built it did a rush job. I want new equipment before I go near that window again." Something flickered across his face. Not warmth. Surprise, maybe, that she had not thanked him, that she had not apologized, that she was already talking about the work instead of the fall. "There won't be a need for new equipment," he said. "There won't be a need for you at all in that particular room. I want it sealed, not restored." Nora got to her feet slowly, testing her ankle, testing her wrist, cataloging damage the way she had learned to do on every job site since she was 19 years old, and her father had first put a hammer in her hand. "I was hired to restore the East Wing," she said. "All of it, that's the contract." "The contract can be amended." "Not by you standing here telling me what a wing full of rot and pigeon nests is going to be, 3 weeks before I've even finished the survey." She dusted plaster off her knees. "With respect, sir, I don't take instructions from men in expensive coats who don't know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one." There was a silence long enough that Nora wondered if she had just talked herself out of a job that was keeping her mother's roof over her mother's head. Then the man said in a voice that had gone even quieter, "It's Alistair." "Not sir. And I know exactly which walls are load-bearing in this house. I grew up counting them." He turned and walked out through the broken doorway without another word, his footsteps echoing down a corridor that had not heard footsteps in over a decade. Nora stood alone in the wrecked room, holding her bleeding hand against her shirt, and looked around properly for the first time. The fire had not touched everything. That was the strange part. Half the room was scorched black, the wallpaper curling off in long burnt ribbons, the ceiling beam above her cracked clean through. But the other half was untouched, frozen, as if the flames had simply lost interest and turned back. A small writing desk sat by the window, undamaged, a layer of dust so thick and undisturbed it looked like snow that had never melted. A child's rocking horse stood in the corner, one ear chipped, still upright after 11 years of silence. Someone had loved this room once, and then, very suddenly, someone had stopped coming into it at all. Nora picked up her chisel from where it had fallen and went to find the rest of her tools, and did not look back at the rocking horse, though she thought about it for the rest of the day. By evening the household had sorted itself into a shape she could understand. There was Mrs. Fairweather, the housekeeper, a broad, no-nonsense woman with kind eyes and a tongue that could strip paint if she wanted it to. There was Peter, the driver, who doubled as a groundskeeper and clearly knew more about the family than he was paid to say. There was a cook named Alice who fed Nora more food than she had eaten in a week and asked no questions in return, which Nora appreciated more than she could say. And there was the Duke, who did not appear at dinner, and whose name nobody said above a certain volume. He wasn't always like this, Mrs. Fairweather told her that first night, over tea in the kitchen after the others had gone to bed. Before the fire he laughed. Believe it or not, Alistair Rain used to laugh loud enough to hear from the stable yard. What happened to him? Mrs. Fairweather's face closed like a door. That's not my story to tell, love. Ask him yourself if you're brave enough. Though I'd wait longer than a day if I were you. You've already put a scare into him once. He put a scare into me. Said Mrs. Fairweather, and there was the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of her mouth. I imagine that's a rare thing in this house. Somebody scaring him for once instead of the other way round. Nora slept badly that night, in a small guest room on the ground floor of the main house, listening to wind move through corridors that had too many corners for her liking. She dreamed of a rocking horse rocking on its own, and woke before dawn with her heart pounding for no reason she could name, and lay there in the dark telling herself it was just an old house doing what old houses did, settling and creaking and playing tricks on tired minds. She got up before the sun and went out to the east wing alone, because sleep clearly was not coming back, and because she wanted to see the damage in daylight without an audience. The morning light came in gray and cold through the broken windows, and it made the burnt half of the nursery look worse, somehow more final. Nora walked the room slowly, notebook in hand, marking cracks, testing floorboards with careful steps, doing the job the way her father had taught her, which was to listen to a building before you tried to fix it. She was crouched by the hearth, running her fingers along a crack in the stone, when she noticed the carving. It was small, easy to miss unless you were exactly where she was, at exactly that angle with exactly that light. 2 sets of initials scratched into the underside of the windowsill, low down, where a child might have knelt to hide their work from adult eyes. ER and AR. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at them for a long moment, and felt something in her chest tighten that had nothing to do with structural engineering. AR, she could guess who that was. She did not know yet who ER had been, but she thought, kneeling there in the cold morning light with dust on her knees and a Duke's secret half buried under her fingers, that she was about to find out whether she wanted to or not. Behind her a floorboard creaked, and she turned fast, heart jumping into her throat. Alistair Rain stood in the doorway, still in yesterday's coat. Like he hadn't slept either, watching her with an expression she could not read at all. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She stood, brushing off her knees, deciding not to mention the initials, not yet, not until she understood the shape of the silence she had wandered into. "This house has opinions about strangers, I think." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face and vanished just as fast. "You have no idea," he said, and for the first time since she had arrived, he did not sound like a man giving orders. He sounded, just for a second, like someone tired of standing guard over a room he could not bring himself to enter. Nora looked past him, down the long burnt corridor stretching out behind them both, and understood, with the same certainty she felt when a beam was about to give way, that this job was going to be about far more than plaster and stone. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not the East Wing, not the nursery. Whatever happened here, it needs fixing too. I don't just mean the walls." Alistair Rain looked at her for a long moment, the wind moving through the broken window between them, carrying the smell of ash that 11 years had never quite managed to clear away. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor without answering, and Nora stood alone in the ruined nursery, holding a secret with 2 letters carved into it, and understood that the real work here had only just begun. The scaffolding gave way on a Tuesday, and this time nobody was standing on it. Nora heard the crash from the stable yard, a long groaning shriek of metal followed by a boom that sent birds scattering off the roofline in a dark cloud. She dropped the plans she was carrying and ran, boots slipping on wet cobblestones, certain that someone was under it, certain that this job was cursed in ways her contract had never mentioned. The scaffolding lay in a twisted heap against the east wing wall, empty, nobody hurt, just cold iron and splintered wood scattered across the grass like the bones of something that had given up trying to stand. Alistair was already there when she arrived, staring at the wreckage with his jaw tight. "Nobody was on it," she said, breathless, hands on her knees. "Nobody was hurt." "This time," he said. "You think I don't know how close that was? I've been checking those joints every morning since the first collapse." She straightened up, anger cutting through her fear the way it always did, quick and clean and useful. "This is exactly why I wanted proper equipment brought up from the yard 3 weeks ago. You said the budget didn't allow it." "The budget allows whatever I decide it allows." "Then decide it allows scaffolding that doesn't try to kill your staff twice in 1 month." He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she could not name, and then he did something she had not expected. He laughed, short, surprised, almost against his will, like the sound had escaped before he could stop it. "You argue with me the way nobody in this house has argued with me in 11 years, he said. "Maybe that's the problem," Nora said, before she could think better of it. "Maybe somebody should have started sooner." The laugh vanished as fast as it had come, and his face closed over again, and Nora understood she had walked right up to the edge of something and put her boot down too hard. She spent that first shaken afternoon walking the grounds instead of returning straight to work, needing the open air and the distance from crumbling stone. The estate stretched further than she had realized from her first glimpse of it, past the stable yard, and a walled kitchen garden gone half wild with the season, down toward a small lake edged in reeds where a pair of swans drifted without any apparent concern for the chaos happening up at the house. She found Alice there, sitting on a low stone bench with a basket of washing she was clearly using as an excuse to sit somewhere quiet. "You get used to the near misses," Alice told her, budging over to make room. "This house doesn't let go of its dead easily, love. Best not to let it take anything else from you either." "You knew him before the fire, I mean, Edmund." Alice's face softened into something private and fond. "Sweetest child you ever saw. Used to sneak into my kitchen for biscuits before supper and swear me to secrecy every single time like it was some grand conspiracy between the 2 of us." She shook her head slowly. Alistair was different even then, quieter, carried things heavier than a boy his age ought to. I used to think it was just his nature. Now I wonder how much of it he learned that one night and never put down again. Nora sat with that a long while, watching the swans, saying nothing, letting the older woman's words settle into the shape of the man she was slowly beginning to understand. "He doesn't talk to anyone the way he started talking to you," Alice added eventually, folding a shirt with more attention than the task strictly required. "Not in all my years here. Make of that what you will. I'm only the cook. I don't pretend to know hearts, but I know what I see, and what I see is a man remembering how to be looked at without flinching." Nora walked back up to the house that evening, turning the words over and over, and found she did not entirely know what to do with them. So she did what she always did with things too large to hold all at once. She went to find work for her hands, and let the rest of it settle slowly, in its own time, the way sawdust settles after a long day of cutting. New scaffolding arrived within 2 days, properly certified, properly inspected, exactly what she had asked for from the start. Nobody said the words please or sorry, but the equipment showed up anyway, and Nora decided that was its own kind of apology, spoken in the only language a man like Alistair Rain seemed comfortable using. Work resumed. The days took on a rhythm she came to depend on. Up before dawn to walk the site alone while the light was soft and the house was quiet. Long hours of careful, physical work, stripping burnt plaster, testing beams, cataloging what could be saved and what needed to be replaced entirely. Evenings with Mrs. Fairweather and Alice in the warm kitchen, trading stories, learning the shape of a household that had learned to live around a wound without ever numbing it. And somewhere in between all of that, without either of them quite deciding to let it happen, Alistair began appearing. At first it was only the East Wing, only official visits, checking her progress with a clipboard he never actually wrote on. Then it became less official. He would appear in the evenings after the work crew had gone, standing in doorways with his hands in his pockets, watching her sand down a windowsill or fit a new hinge, saying very little, staying far longer than the work required. "You don't have to supervise me," Nora told him one evening, not looking up from the drawer runner she was repairing. "I promise I know how a hinge works. I'm not supervising." Then, what would you call standing in a doorway for 40 minutes without speaking? He considered this with the seriousness of a man solving an actual problem. "Company," he said finally, like the word cost him something to hand over. Nora glanced up at that, surprised, and found him looking not at her but at the drawer in her hands, at the small brass handle she had just polished back to a shine it had not seen in over a decade. "That was my mother's writing desk," he said. "Before it was in the nursery, it was in her study. She gave it to my brother when he turned 6. He used to keep beetles in that drawer, dead ones. He thought it made him a scientist." It was the first time he had mentioned a brother. Nora kept her hands moving, sanding lightly at the edge of the drawer, careful not to look up too fast, careful not to spook whatever fragile thing had just decided to speak. "What was his name?" she asked. Something shifted in his face, a door swinging halfway open and then catching on its own hinge. "Edmund," he said, and then before she could ask anything else, "The nursery stays closed. I told you that already." "You told me the room stays closed. You didn't tell me why." "I don't have to tell you why. I own the house." "You don't own the truth, though. That belongs to whoever's brave enough to go looking for it." Nora set the drawer down and finally looked at him directly, and something about her steadiness seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. "I found the initials Alistair, ER and AR, carved under the windowsill. I haven't asked you about them because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. But don't stand there and pretend there's nothing to tell." For a moment she thought he might actually answer. His jaw worked. His hand drifted to the ring on his smallest finger, a heavy old signet with a worn crest, and his thumb moved across it the way some people worried a coin in their pocket, over and over, an old habit worn smooth by years of use. Then he turned and walked out, and did not come back that evening or the next. Nora told herself it did not matter. She had a job to do and a mother's roof to fix, and a duke's private grief was not her business no matter how many times his footsteps stopped outside her door at night and then walked away again without knocking. But she started leaving a second cup out with her evening tea anyway, in case he happened to appear, which he sometimes did, and sometimes did not, and either way she never asked him to explain himself. He started leaving firewood outside her workroom in the mornings, though the room already had a full supply and did not particularly need it, cut and stacked with more care than firewood strictly required. Neither of them mentioned it. It became, without either of them nomming it, a kind of language, small offerings passed back and forth across a silence too old and too heavy to speak through directly. October came in wet and gray, and the work in the east wing began to show real progress. Beams replaced, plaster stripped back to honest stone, the scorched half of what had once been Edmund's nursery slowly, carefully, coming back into the light, though Nora was careful never to erase what had happened there entirely. She left one blackened beam exposed above the door, sanded smooth but unpainted, a scar the room could carry honestly instead of hiding. She was up on a ladder one gray afternoon, fitting a new pane of glass into the nursery window, when she heard footsteps behind her that she now knew without turning around. "You've kept the burnt beam," Alastair said. "I have. I asked you to make the room presentable." "I did. Presentable doesn't mean pretending nothing happened here. A room that pretends nothing happened isn't a home, it's a stage set. I don't build stage sets, Alastair. I build places people can actually live in." He was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the beam, at the dark line running through the pale new plaster like a river through fresh snow. "My father used to say something like that," he said finally, "about honest wood. He was a carpenter too, in his own way, before the title, before all of this. He built half the stable block himself, back when my grandfather still ran the estate." "What happened to him?" "He died the same year as my brother." Alastair's voice did not change, did not crack, stayed level and controlled in a way that told Nora more than any tears could have. It was not a good year for this family. Nora climbed down from the ladder slowly and stood beside him, close enough that she could see the tension held tight along his shoulders, the careful, practiced stillness of a man who had spent 11 years making sure nobody ever saw him fall apart. "You don't have to tell me the whole story today," she said. "Or tomorrow, or ever if that's what you need. But I'd like you to know that I'm not asking because I want gossip for the kitchen. I'm asking because I think this house has been holding its breath for 11 years, and I don't think that's good for the beams or the plaster or you." Something moved behind his eyes then, something that looked almost like relief and almost like fear, both at once, tangled together the way old grief so often is. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said abruptly, like the words had escaped before his usual caution could catch them. "Not in the main hall, in the kitchen with Mrs. Fairweather and the others. I find I don't much like eating alone anymore." It was such a small thing to ask. And yet Nora understood, standing there in a half-repaired nursery with sawdust on her hands and 11 years of silence pressing in around them both, that it was not a small thing at all. "I'd like that," she said. That evening, for the first time since she had arrived at Ashcombe Castle, the Duke came down to the kitchen for dinner, and sat at the long wooden table with his staff and a carpenter from the north, and Mrs. Fairweather's hands shook slightly as she set down his plate, like she could not quite believe what she was seeing. Peter, halfway through a story about a horse that had once gotten loose during a summer fete, faltered mid-sentence when he noticed who had joined them, and only continued once Alastair nodded for him to go on, plainly curious to hear how it ended. He did not laugh again that night, but he stayed until the fire burned low, listening more than talking, and when Nora finally said good night and turned to go, he caught her eye across the room and held it a moment longer than politeness required, and something passed between them that neither of them had a name for yet, though both of them felt its weight all the same. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows of the east wing, and somewhere in that empty, half-mended nursery, the rocking horse creaked once on its own, and settled, as if something in the house had finally, quietly begun to exhale. A rock came through the workroom window at midnight, wrapped in a torn scrap of paper, and Nora was awake and reaching for it before the last shard of glass had finished falling. She unfolded the paper with hands that were not quite steady. The message was short, written in blunt pencil, the letters pressed hard enough to tear the paper in places. Leave Ashcombe. Some doors were shut for a reason. Nora stood in the broken glass in her bare feet, reading it twice, then a third time, and felt something cold settle low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the night air pouring through the shattered window. She thought about waking the house. She thought about Alistair and how carefully he guarded every piece of this story, and decided instead to wait until morning, to bring it to him in daylight, when neither of them would be caught off guard by the dark. She barely slept. When dawn finally came gray and thin over the hills, she dressed, wrapped the note carefully in a clean cloth, and went looking for him. She found him in the stable yard, feeding an old gray mare some sort of biscuit from his coat pocket, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him, right up until she showed him the note. Then his whole body went still, the same stillness she had seen in the burnt nursery, the stillness of a man bracing for a blow he had been expecting his whole life. Where did this come from? Through my window, last night. She watched his face carefully. Alistair, who would want me gone badly enough to throw a rock through a window at midnight. He turned the note over in his hands, reading it again and again, his jaw tightening with every pass. There's a man in the village, he said finally. Name of Dennis Ray. He used to work here years back as a groundsman under my father. He left after the fire and never came back, and every so often he sends up a message like this, when he hears the east wing is being touched again. Why would he care what happens to your house? Alistair's hand drifted to the ring on his smallest finger, the old habit, the worn crest under his thumb. Because he believes the fire was not an accident. He spent 11 years telling anyone who will listen that someone in this family said it deliberately, and that the truth was buried along with my brother. The cold in Nora's stomach spread further, settling into something sharper. Is that true? No, Alistair said, too fast, and then more carefully, like he was correcting a wound rather than a lie. I don't believe it's true. I was there. I know what happened better than any man drinking in a village pub 11 years after the fact. Then tell me. I can't. His voice cracked slightly on the word, the first real crack she had heard in it since she had arrived, and he turned away from her fast, back toward the mare, back toward something he could touch without it demanding an answer from him. Not yet. Please, Nora, not yet. She did not push. She had learned enough of this house by now to know that some doors opened only when a person was ready to walk through them, and that pushing too hard on a locked door usually only broke the hinges rather than the lock. But she went looking for Dennis Ray anyway, 2 days later on her one afternoon off, taking the long walk down into the village under a sky heavy with the promise of rain. She found him in the pub, an old man now, gray-bearded and hollow-eyed, nursing a drink at a corner table like he had been nursing it for 11 years straight. You're the one working the east wing, he said, before she had even introduced herself. Word traveled fast in a village this small. You should listen to your own advice and leave. Before that house takes something from you too. What did it take from you, Mr. Ray? His eyes, when they finally met hers, were wet with something that looked less like anger and more like grief that had curdled over years into something bitter and hard to hold. My son, he said. Edmund Rain wasn't the only child in that nursery the night of the fire. My boy Charlie was there too, playing with the young masters, the way village boys sometimes did back then when the old Duke still let such things happen. He drank slow, deliberate. Charlie didn't come out of that fire either, but nobody remembers his name in the papers. Nobody built him a headstone in the family plot, just the Rain boy, just Edmund. My son burned in that nursery, and the world forgot him inside a year. Nora sat across from him, feeling the weight of a grief she had not expected, one that ran parallel to the Rain family's own and had never once been allowed to touch it. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it completely. "I didn't know." Nobody does. That's rather the point of money and titles, isn't it? They decide whose grief gets remembered. He looked at her carefully then, something calculating behind the grief. "You've gotten close to him, haven't you, the Duke?" "I'm restoring his house, that's all." "That's not all, and we both know it. I've heard the talk from the kitchen staff who still visit their families in the village, dinners together, firewood left at doors." He smiled, thin and humorless. "Be careful, girl. That family has a habit of losing the people closest to them." She sat with the old man a while longer, letting the rain rattle against the pub windows, and asked him gently what Charlie had been like, because it seemed to her that nobody had asked him that question in a very long time, and grief left alone too long tends to calcify into anger simply because nobody has offered it anywhere softer to go. "Loud," Dennis said, and for the first time something like a smile touched his weathered face. Loudest boy in the village, could hear him laughing halfway down the lane. He idolized young Edmund something fierce, followed him everywhere he was allowed and plenty of places he wasn't. I used to tell him off for climbing over the estate wall to go looking for trouble with the young masters. Wish now I'd let him climb that wall every single day he wanted to." "You couldn't have known." "No," Dennis agreed, quiet now, all the earlier hardness gone out of him. "None of us knew. That's rather the cruelty of it, isn't it? You only ever learn which days mattered most after they've already gone." He looked at her carefully then, some of his old suspicion returning, though softer now, more curious than hostile. "Why does a carpenter from the north care so much about an old man's dead son?" "Because somebody should," Nora said simply and meant it. She left him a little while later, promising nothing, though something in her chest had already decided that Charlie Ray's name deserved to be spoken inside the walls of Ashcombe, just as surely as Edmund's did, whether the family had realized that yet or not. Nora walked back up the hill to Ashcombe with the rain finally breaking overhead, soaking through her coat, thinking about a boy named Charlie Ray who had died in a fire 11 years ago, and whose name nobody in the great house had ever once mentioned to her. She did not tell Alistair where she had been. Not yet. But that evening, over dinner in the kitchen, she watched him more carefully than usual, watched the practiced ease he wore like armor, and wondered how much of it was covering a wound far larger than she had first understood. Later, drying dishes beside Mrs. Fairweather while the others drifted off to bed, she found herself asking, carefully, whether the housekeeper had ever known a boy named Charlie Ray. Mrs. Fairweather's hands went still in the sink water for a long moment before she answered. "I did. Sweet, cheeky thing, always underfoot. It near broke this house in two when we lost him alongside Master Edmund, and then it broke a second time when nobody outside these walls was permitted to grieve him openly. The old Duke was not a cruel man, not exactly, but he was proud, and pride does strange, unkind things to a man drowning in his own loss. He couldn't bear 2 funerals under his own name, so he simply pretended there had only ever been one. That seems like a hard thing to carry, for everyone." "It was." Mrs. Fairweather resumed her washing, slow and thoughtful. "I've often wondered if that's part of what's kept Alistair so shut up inside himself all these years. Grieving in secret is a lonely business. Love, whoever you're grieving, and a boy who watched his father hide half the truth learns early that some truths are meant to stay hidden. I don't think he even realizes he's still doing it most days." Nora thought about that long after the kitchen had gone dark and quiet, turning it over the way she turned over a difficult joint before deciding how best to fix it, and resolved, without quite knowing how yet, that she would find the right moment to bring Charlie Ray's name up into the light where it belonged. The work continued through November. the nursery slowly taking shape into something that could, one day, hold light again instead of only ash. Nora threw herself into it the way she always threw herself into difficult jobs, hands busy, mind working through problems one joint and one hinge at a time, because it was easier than sitting still with everything she now knew and could not yet say out loud. Alistair came to the workroom most evenings now, a habit so settled between them that Mrs. Fairweather had started leaving 2 plates out instead of 1 without being asked. They talked about small things mostly. The weather, the estate accounts, which Nora had opinions about, freely given, whether he wanted them or not. Books he had read as a boy, before the fire, in a version of himself he rarely let anyone see. The work through those weeks settled into something that almost felt, to Nora's surprise, like peace. Frost crept up the edges of the estate's windows overnight and burned off slow each morning under a pale sun, and the nursery walls came together board by board, coat by coat, the room shedding its old grief one careful layer at a time without ever quite forgetting it had been there. One evening, fitting a new pane into what had once been Edmund's window, Nora found something tucked behind the old, cracked glass, hidden in the gap between the frame and the stone. A small folded piece of paper, brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible. A child's drawing, 2 stick figures under a crayon sun, one taller, one smaller, holding hands. Underneath, in careful, uneven letters, a child's handwriting spelled out 2 names. Alistair and Edmund, brothers forever. Nora sat very still, holding the drawing carefully in both hands, feeling its weight far beyond the paper it was made of. She found Alistair in the library an hour later, staring into a fire that had burned down to embers, and set the drawing on the table in front of him without a word. He looked at it for a long time before he touched it, his hand hovering above the paper like it might burn him too. "He drew this the week before," he said finally, his voice very quiet. "We'd had an argument, stupid, the kind of argument brothers have over a toy over nothing at all. He wanted to make it up to me. He always wanted to make things right, even when he was the one who'd started it. You don't have to keep carrying this alone, Alistair. You don't understand." He set the drawing down with great care, like it might shatter, and finally looked at her directly, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw the full weight of what he had been holding behind 11 years of careful, controlled silence. The fire started in the fireplace grate, a spark that jumped further than it should have. "I was the one who lit it that night, because Edmund was cold, and our nurse had gone downstairs, and I wanted to prove I was old enough to be trusted with matches." The room went very quiet. Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows, steady and patient, the way it had probably tapped against those same windows on the night 11 years ago that had broken this family apart. "I was 9 years old," Alistair said, and his voice had gone somewhere far away, somewhere Nora suspected he had not let himself visit in a very long time. "I lit the fire to keep my brother warm, and I fell asleep in front of it, and by the time I woke the whole grate had gone up and the curtains were burning and I could not find him in the smoke. I could not find him, Nora. I looked everywhere I could see and I could not find my own brother, and then the smoke took the rest of the room from me too, and someone pulled me out. And by the time they got back in for Edmund, it was too late." "That was not your fault," Nora said, and meant it with everything in her. "You were a child. Children build fires that get out of hand every single day of the year. That does not make you a murderer, Alistair. It makes you a 9-year-old boy who loved his brother enough to want him warm." "Tell that to Dennis Ray," he said bitterly. "Tell that to the village that still whispers about it. Tell that to the parts of me that have never once believed it, no matter how many times my own mother tried to say those exact words before she died." "I'm telling you," Nora said, and reached across the small table between them and took his hand in both of hers, feeling the old signet ring cold under her palm. "Right now. I'm telling you, and I mean it, and I am not going anywhere, no matter what threats come through my window at midnight." He looked down at their joined hands like he could not quite believe they were real, and something in his shoulders finally, after 11 long years, began to loosen. Neither of them said anything else that night. They sat together by the dying fire until it went cold, and Nora did not let go of his hand, and outside the rain kept falling steadily over a house that had spent 11 years holding its breath and was only now slowly beginning to remember how to breathe out. Smoke woke her, thin and acrid, curling under her door before the first alarm bell even started ringing. Nora was out of bed and pulling on her boots before her mind had fully caught up with her body, old instinct from a childhood, spent in a house with a temperamental wood stove taking over completely. She grabbed her coat, threw open her door, and ran straight into a corridor already hazy with drifting smoke, the bell overhead clanging loud enough to rattle her teeth. Fire in the east wing, someone was shouting, Peter's voice cutting through the chaos. Everyone out now. Her first thought was the nursery. Weeks of careful work, the new beams, the honest scar she had left exposed above the door, the drawing of two brothers holding hands under a crayon sun that Alistair had asked her to frame and hang back on the freshly painted wall. Her second thought was Alistair himself, and where he might be standing in a burning building that had already taken one member of his family from him. She ran toward the smoke instead of away from it, ignoring every shout behind her telling her to get outside, and found him exactly where some cold, certain part of her had known he would be, standing frozen in the corridor outside the nursery, staring into the drifting smoke like the last 11 years had folded themselves up and dropped him straight back into the worst night of his life. Alistair. She grabbed his arm hard, and he did not respond, his eyes fixed and glassy, his breathing coming in short, shallow pulls that had nothing to do with the smoke and everything to do with memory. Alistair, look at me. This is not that night. You are 38 years old and I am right here and we are both getting out of this corridor right now. Something in her voice seemed to reach him where the shouting had not. He blinked hard and his eyes finally focused on her face instead of some point 11 years in the past, and he let her pull him back down the corridor, away from the smoke, out through the side door into the cold, wet night air. The fire brigade arrived within 20 minutes, fast for a village that far from anywhere, and made quick work of what turned out to be a contained blaze, started in an unused storeroom 2 doors down from the nursery, far enough from the newly restored rooms that the damage, in the end, was smaller than Nora's racing heart had feared. But contained did not mean accidental. The fire chief found the evidence himself, a scorched rag and an empty tin that had once held lamp oil, tucked behind a stack of old crates in a room that had no business having either. He crouched by the scorched crates a while longer, turning the empty tin over carefully in gloved hands, comparing it against notes he had jotted in a small, weathered notebook before he finally straightened and delivered his findings plainly, without any effort to soften them. Somebody set this deliberately, he told Alistair, standing in the wreckage of the storeroom as dawn broke gray and cold outside. Amateur job, thank goodness. Whoever did it didn't understand how quickly a contained space like this would fill with smoke rather than flame. Lucky escape all around. Nora watched Alistair's face as he took in the news, watched the color drain slowly from it, watched him reach for the ring on his smallest finger and turn it, once, twice, 3 times, an old habit stretched thin under new weight. Dennis Ray, he said quietly, once the fire chief had moved off to finish his report. You don't know that. He sent me threats for 11 years, Nora. He's told half the village that this family should burn the way his son burned. What else am I supposed to think? I think grief makes people say terrible things they'd never actually do, Nora said carefully, remembering the old man's hollow eyes across a pub table, the curdled bitterness underneath a pain that had never once been allowed to be spoken aloud in public. But I don't know him well enough to promise you he wouldn't. Neither do you, not really. You've spent 11 years avoiding him the same way you avoided this whole wing of your own house." Mrs. Fairweather found them there in the wet grass a short while later, her face drawn and pale, a blanket in her arms that she wrapped around Nora's shoulders without being asked. The staff had gathered near the stable block, counting heads, checking faces, the whole household still trembling faintly with the particular fright of a danger that had come and mostly gone before anyone fully understood its shape. "Everyone's accounted for," she reported, though her eyes lingered worriedly on Alistair, who stood apart from the others, staring at the scorched storeroom door like it might yet open onto something worse. "Whatever this was, love, it was caught in time. That's what matters this morning." "Caught in time is not the same as understood," Alistair said quietly, and turned and walked back into the house without waiting for anyone to follow. Nora let him go, that first morning, sensing he needed the walls of his own study around him more than he needed company just then. But she watched from the kitchen window as he crossed the courtyard, shoulders set in the same rigid line she remembered from her very first day at Ashcombe, and understood that whatever ground they had gained together over the past weeks, fear had just clawed a fair portion of it straight back. Something in Alistair's face shuddered closed at that, fast and complete, a door slamming that she had thought, after the library, after the drawing, after the fire 11 years past finally spoken aloud between them, might never close again quite so hard. "I need to think," he said, and walked away from her across the wet grass without looking back, and Nora stood alone in the gray morning light and felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the smoke still clinging to her hair. He avoided her for 3 days after that. Not obviously. He was too controlled a man to make a scene of it, too well trained in the art of careful distance. But the evening visits to her workroom stopped. The firewood stopped appearing outside her door. When they passed each other in the halls, he offered polite, empty words about the weather and moved on before she could say anything real. And Nora recognized the pattern for exactly what it was, because she had built the same walls herself once, a long time ago, after a loss of her own that she rarely let herself think about. He was not angry with her. He was afraid, and it was easier by far to be distant than to sit with a fear that large. She kept working through those 3 quiet days, because work was the one thing that never abandoned her, sanding and fitting and measuring with a kind of fierce concentration that left little room for the ache building steadily under her ribs. Mrs. Fairweather noticed, of course, and said nothing directly, only made sure there was always tea near wherever Nora happened to be, and left her to it. On the second evening, Alice found her still in the workroom long after dark, staring at a length of unfinished skirting board she had not touched in over an hour. "He does this," Alice said gently, setting down a plate of bread and cheese Nora had not asked for but was grateful for all the same. "Pulls in on himself like a fist closing. Did it after his mother passed too. Went 3 weeks barely speaking a full sentence to anyone in this house, staff included. It isn't about you, love. Whatever it might feel like from where you're standing. I know that, knowing it doesn't make the waiting any easier." "No," Alice agreed, with the plain, unhurried honesty of a woman who had watched this particular pattern play out more than once. "It rarely does, but for what it's worth, I've never once seen him pull away from someone and still leave firewood outside their door the very same morning." Nora looked up at that, surprised, and Alice only smiled and nodded toward the small stack that had, in fact, appeared outside the workroom door that very morning quietly, without a word attached to it, exactly as it always had. On the 4th day, Nora found him in the stable yard again, feeding the same old gray mare, and this time she did not wait to be invited into whatever silence he was building around himself. "You're doing the thing again," she said, coming to stand beside him, close enough that the mare huffed warm breath against both their hands at once. "The thing where you decide it's safer to lose people quietly, on your own terms, than to risk losing them the way you lost Edmund. I understand it. I do. But I'm not going anywhere, Alistair, and I'm certainly not leaving because a scared old man with a lamp oil tin got frightened enough by his own grief to do something foolish. You could have died in that fire, he said, and his voice cracked properly this time, no careful control left in it at all. Do you understand that? I have already lost one person I loved to smoke in that exact corridor. I cannot do it again. I would rather send you away safe and angry than keep you here and risk burying you too. The word loved hung in the cold morning air between them, spoken in fear rather than tenderness, but spoken all the same, and Nora felt it land somewhere deep in her chest, warm despite everything. Then don't send me away, she said quietly. Fix the wing you're afraid of instead of running from another one. That's what you asked me to come here and do in the first place, whether you knew it at the time or not. He looked at her for a long moment, something breaking open behind his careful eyes, and then, for the first time since she had known him, Alistair Rain reached for her instead of pulling away, his hand finding hers over the mare's warm neck, holding on like a man finally choosing to stop bracing against a wave and let it carry him instead. They went to see Dennis Ray together the following afternoon, walking down into the village side by side under a pale winter sun, and found the old man in his small cottage garden, pulling weeds with hands that shook slightly in the cold. He looked up and saw them together, and his face went through several emotions at once: fear, then defiance, then something that looked, underneath it all, exhausted. I didn't set that fire, he said, before either of them could speak. Whatever you've come to accuse me of, I didn't do it. I've sent angry words up that hill for 11 years, I'll grant you that. But I never once meant to burn that house down with anyone inside it. I know what fire does to a family. I'd not wish that on anyone, not even a Rain. We believe you, Nora said, and meant it, watching the old man's shoulders sag slightly with a relief he clearly had not expected to feel. Then who? Alistair started and stopped, some new thought moving behind his eyes. It was Dennis in the end, who gave them the answer, gruff and reluctant, like it cost him something to hand it over. There was a young man in the village, he said, a distant cousin of the old steward who had been dismissed from Ashcombe's staff that same autumn for stealing from the estate accounts, angry and desperate, and looking for someone to blame. He had been overheard in the pub, more than once, muttering threats nobody had taken seriously enough to report. Alistair went pale, then very still, then, quietly, thanked the old man for his honesty in a voice that carried real weight behind it for the first time in 11 years. Before they left, standing at the low garden gate with the wind picking up around them, Alistair turned back. I never properly said this to you all these years, he said to Dennis, his voice steady but not cold, not anymore. Your son died in my family's house, and his name has never once appeared on any stone beside my brother's, and that was wrong of my father, and wrong of me for not correcting it sooner. I intend to fix that. Charlie deserves a place in that memory as much as Edmund does. Dennis Ray's face crumpled, just for a moment, 11 years of grief finally finding somewhere honest to land, and he said nothing at all, only nodded, hard, and turned back to his weeds so neither of them would see him properly break. They walked back up the hill together in silence, the wind sharp and clean around them, and somewhere past the old stone gate at the bottom of the drive, Alistair reached over and took Nora's hand again, holding it the whole way up, and neither of them let go until the castle rose gray and solid against the darkening sky above them, waiting, at last, for something other than grief to fill its empty rooms. Blue lights swept across the castle walls at 2 in the morning, and this time it was not a fire truck. Nora heard the commotion from her window and was downstairs before she had properly finished dressing, arriving in the great hall just as 2 police officers led a young man out through the front doors in handcuffs, his face pale and furious under the harsh porch light. She recognized him vaguely from the village, a thin, sharp-featured man she had seen once or twice in the pub, always at the edges of conversations, never quite part of them. Caleb Dre, Alistair said quietly, coming to stand beside her as the officers guided the young man toward a waiting car. "Cousin to the steward I dismissed last autumn for theft. It seems he decided the fire in the storeroom was only the beginning of what he had planned." What was he planning? According to the officers, he'd been seen buying more lamp oil just yesterday and asking questions in the village about which nights the house would be fullest with staff. They caught him trying to get into the wine cellar tonight with a can of it in his bag. Alistair's jaw was tight, but his voice, for the first time in days, carried no fear underneath the anger, only relief that a shapeless threat finally had a name and a face, and now, a set of handcuffs. "It seems my family's ruin was never really about grief at all. Just a man angry about losing a job he was never entitled to keep in the first place." Nora let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 11 years, though she had only known this house for 4 months. "It's over then," she said. "It's over," Alistair agreed, and for the first time since she had met him, standing in the wrecked nursery on her very first morning at Ashcombe, something in his shoulders looked genuinely, completely unburdened. The days that followed the arrest had a strange, weightless quality to them, the particular relief of a held breath finally let go. Mrs. Fairweather threw open windows across the whole house that had not been opened in years, declaring the place needed proper airing after so long spent shut up tight around its own fear. Peter whistled while he worked in the stable yard for the first time since Nora had arrived. Even the old gray mare seemed to hold her head a little higher, as though horses too could sense when a household had finally set something heavy down. Alistair spent a full afternoon in his study going through the estate's old records, and emerged near evening with a request that surprised everyone, Nora included. He wanted the wages and pension owed to the dismissed steward's family properly settled, whatever the man's nephew had done, on the reasoning that one person's wrongdoing should not become an excuse to withhold what was rightfully owed to people who had done nothing at all. "That's not going to undo what he tried to do to this house," Nora pointed out, though she said it gently, watching him sign the papers at his desk with a steadiness she had not seen in him before. "No," Alistair agreed. "But my father taught me, without ever meaning to, that unpaid debts curdle into exactly the kind of anger that burns down storerooms in the middle of the night. I'd rather not hand the next generation of this estate the same inheritance he handed me." Winter passed slowly and then all at once, the way winters do, and the work in the East Wing continued, faster now, easier, without the shadow of unexplained fires and midnight threats hanging over every board and beam. Nora oversaw the last of the plastering herself, choosing colors that honored the room's history rather than erasing it, warm creams and soft blues instead of anything too bright, too new, too eager to pretend the past had never happened. The burnt beam above the nursery door stayed exactly where she had first sanded it smooth, dark against the pale new ceiling, a scar the room wore honestly instead of hiding. She hung the child's drawing in a proper frame on the newly painted wall, 2 stick figures under a crayon sun, 2 names in careful, uneven letters. Alistair stood beside her the day she hung it, and did not look away from it the way he once might have, and after a long moment he reached out and touched the glass gently, right over his brother's name, and smiled, small but real, the kind of smile Mrs. Fairweather had once told her belonged to a different, younger version of this man, a version Nora was slowly starting to believe might still exist somewhere underneath all that careful control. In the village, a new stone went up in the small churchyard that spring, quiet and unannounced, no grand ceremony, no newspapers invited. Just a modest granite marker beside the old Rain family plot, bearing a single name and 2 simple dates. Charlie Ray, beloved son, never forgotten. Dennis stood before it the morning it was unveiled, an old man in a worn coat, and did not say much of anything at all, only reached out and rested his hand flat against the cool stone for a long, long moment, while Alistair stood a respectful distance away and let him have that silence uninterrupted. Afterward, walking back up toward the castle together, Dennis caught Alistair's arm. "Your father would not have done this," the old man said, not unkindly, more like an observation 11 years in the making. He was a proud man, too proud to admit the estate owed anyone anything beyond wages and a decent reference. "I'm not my father," Alistair said simply. Dennis studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, years of hard-held bitterness finally finding somewhere honest to set itself down. "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose you are, not anymore. That carpenter of yours has done more than fix your walls, young man, if you don't mind an old fool saying so." Alistair glanced back down the hill, to where Nora stood near the churchyard gate, waiting for him with her hands in her coat pockets and the spring wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, and did not bother denying it. By early summer, the east wing was finished. Truly finished, in a way it had not been in over a decade, every room aired out and repainted, every window fitted with new glass that let the light pour in clean and warm across floors that had once only known ash and silence. The nursery, at the heart of it all, stood bright and whole, the rocking horse restored and repositioned by the window where morning sun could reach it, the child's drawing framed on the wall, the dark scarred beam standing honest witness above the door to everything the room had survived. Mrs. Fairweather cried, quietly and without apology, the first time she walked through it, and told Nora, in a voice thick with feeling, that she had not believed she would live to see that particular door stand open again. The main house itself had changed too, in ways less visible but no less real. Alistair came down to the kitchen for dinner most nights now, not out of loneliness but out of something closer to actual belonging, laughing more often than Nora had thought possible in her first weeks at Ashcombe, teasing Alice about her cooking, listening to Peter's long, rambling stories with genuine attention instead of polite endurance. The staff, who had spent 11 years tiptoeing around a grief-heavy silence, seemed to breathe easier too, as though the whole household had been holding something in for over a decade and had only now remembered how to let it go. Nora finished the last of her contracted work in June, standing in the completed nursery on a bright morning with sunlight pouring through clean glass, running her hand along the smooth new windowsill where 2 childhood initials still remained, carefully preserved rather than sanded away. "The job's done," she told Alistair, who had come to find her there as he so often did now, drawn to that room the way he had once avoided it entirely. "Contract's finished. I suppose that means I should be heading back north, back to my mother's leaking roof and the rest of my ordinary life." "Is that what you want?" She considered the question honestly, looking around the bright, warm room they had built together out of ash and careful hands, and 11 years of unspoken grief finally spoken aloud. "No," she admitted, "it's not what I want at all, but I don't know what you're asking me to stay for, Alistair. I'm a carpenter. I fix broken houses for a living. I don't know how to be a duchess, and I'm not entirely sure I'd want to learn." "I'm not asking you to be a duchess." He crossed the room to stand in front of her, taking both her hands in his, the old signet ring cool against her fingers the way it had been that very first night in the library, only nothing about this moment felt heavy the way that one had. "I'm asking you to stay because this house has never once felt like a home to me, not truly, not since I was 9 years old and afraid of every room in it. And then you arrived, complaining about my scaffolding and refusing to seal off a nursery I was too frightened to enter, and somewhere in the middle of all that arguing, it started to feel like somewhere I actually wanted to live again." "That's a very roundabout way of asking a woman to stay," Nora said, though her voice had gone soft, and her eyes had gone bright, and she made no effort at all to pull her hands free of his. "I've had very little practice," Alistair admitted, and there was that laugh again, the rare, surprised one that seemed to catch him off guard every single time it escaped. 11 years of practice at keeping people out and none whatsoever at asking them to stay. Bear with me." "I think," Nora said slowly, that I could manage a little patience for the right person. He kissed her then, gently, in the warm, bright center of a room that had spent 11 years holding nothing but ash and silence. And somewhere outside, past the newly glazed windows, summer moved warm and easy across the hills of Ashcombe, over a churchyard with two boys' names finally resting side by side in memory, over a village that had slowly begun to let go of an old, bitter grief, over a house that had, at last, remembered how to hold light instead of only shadow. They married the following spring, a small, quiet ceremony in the village church, with Mrs. Fairweather crying happily in the front pew and Dennis Ray, invited and genuinely welcomed, standing near the back with his hat in his hands, watching a family that had once caused him so much pain finally choose, in its own imperfect way, to make things right. Nora wore a plain cream dress with no lace and no fuss, because grand things had never suited her, and she saw no reason to start pretending otherwise on her own wedding day. And Alistair told her, quietly, just before the ceremony began, that she looked exactly like the kind of storm a man ought to be lucky enough to walk straight into. The reception afterward was held not in the grand hall, which had always felt too large and too cold for real celebration, but in the sunlit nursery itself, tables pushed against the newly painted walls, the rocking horse draped in ribbon for the occasion, the framed drawing of two boys under a crayon sun looking down over the whole gathering like a quiet blessing finally allowed to rest easy. Alice outdid herself with the food. Peter told the same rambling story 3 times to 3 different groups of guests and nobody minded in the least. Dennis Ray, 3 cups of cider into the evening, was persuaded onto the small dance floor by Mrs. Fairweather and laughed, loud and genuine, for what several villagers later swore was the first time in over a decade. Alistair found Nora near the window as the light began to fade, watching the guests move easily through a room that had once held nothing but ash, and slipped his hand into hers without a word. 11 years I stood outside this door, he said quietly. Never once imagined it could sound like this again. Houses remember how to be homes, Nora said, leaning her head against his shoulder. They just need somebody patient enough to remind them. The nursery, in the years that followed, did not stay empty for long, and when the first cries of a new child rang out through those newly plastered walls, nobody in the house flinched at the sound the way they might once have. They simply smiled and gathered close, and let the old room finally do the only thing it had ever truly been built for, which was to hold a family safe, and warm and entirely, unapologetically alive. Years later, when the child was old enough to ask about the dark, honest beam still standing above the nursery door, Alistair would kneel down to their height and tell them, gently, about an uncle they had never met, a boy who had loved fiercely and laughed loudly and was never, ever to be forgotten simply because he was gone. And when the child asked why the beam had not been painted over like the rest of the room, he would only smile and say that some scars were worth keeping because they reminded a house and the people living in it of exactly how far they had come. Alistair Rain, who had once stood guard over a locked door for 11 long years, learned at last to leave it open, morning light pouring freely through glass that had been broken once and was now, thanks to careful hands and a stubborn heart from the north, whole again. And Nora Bennett, who had come to Ashcombe expecting nothing more than a difficult job and a decent paycheck, found instead the one thing she had never known she was looking for. Not merely a castle restored, but a man given back to himself, and a home, finally, that both of them could truly call their own.